This camera is 125 years old, and this one, well, it came out pretty recently. Today we're going to compare these two cameras plus 5 other cameras that came out in between the launch of these two guys to see how much photography gear has evolved over the past 100 years and if any of these older cameras still have a place in a modern photographer's camera bag. So let's get started with the oldest camera that we have here, the Kodak Brownie. Imagine walking into a store in 1900 with a single dollar bill. Well, what could you buy? A few loaves of bread, maybe some eggs, or how about the camera that would revolutionize photography forever? Now, the Kodak Brownie is it's a super basic camera. It has a shutter, a viewfinder, it uses a simple meniscus lens that focuses light onto 620 film, and there's no ability to change focus, change aperture, or, well, change any settings at all. You fire the shutter and, well, you hope for the best. Now, the 620 film that the Brownie takes is no longer in production, so I modified some 120 film to fit in the camera so I could take some photos with it. And, well, I found pretty quickly that shooting with the Kodak Brownie was quite a challenge. And I'm going to give you some example photos in a second. But the main thing to note with this camera is that Kodak sold 10 million of them in the first 5 years that it was on sale. It was the first camera on the market that really took off. And this is because you didn't need to be rich, you didn't need any training to use the camera, you just needed that $1 bill and a roll of film. And here's a fun fact, some of the most iconic images of the 20th century, pictures of the survivors of the Titanic and the iceberg that it hit, were photographed using this little black cardboard box by Bernice Palmer, who just happened to be on the ship that went to rescue them. Now, I'm no Bernice Palmer, but I tried to take a few photos with the Kodak Brownie myself, and, well, they turned out to be pretty terrible. Now, this literal Kodak Brownie that I was shooting with, well, it's over 100 years old for a start. I had to modify the film to get it in there, and it wasn't the easiest shooting experience. But with the next camera in our timeline, everything got a little bit more straightforward. Next up, we have the granddad of Instagram captions coming straight from the 1920s with the Autographic Kodak. You can think of it as the world's first camera that allowed EXIF data. You know, that technical information that your digital camera stores with every photo. But instead of the automatic metadata stored to your digital images, the autographic feature worked by opening a door on the back of the camera that exposes a small section of the film. The photographer then used the included stylus to write a note directly on the film to remind them of the scene, the settings of the camera, or whatever else they wanted to document. And because the film includes an additional layer of carbon impregnated paper, the markings the stylus make create a dark patch that's been written on, and that's how the data gets recorded. What's also pretty cool is that you can see that the Kodak No. 1 Autographic is a bellows camera. This means that by using bellows, the camera could expand to create the correct distance from lens to film, so you get a focused image, whilst also being able to be collapsed back down to a very compact size, so it's easy to take with you on your adventures. And on top of all of that, taking a massive step up from the Kodak Brownie, the Kodak No. 1 Autographic now gives us a user-changeable aperture and shutter speed, which means that getting the correct exposure of our image, so it's not too bright or it's not too dark, becomes now skill rather than basically pot luck. And unfortunately, this is the only camera in the video that I didn't manage to take any pictures with because, well, the shutter mechanism is really satisfying to press. And so, of course, being an idiot, I fiddled with it and I broke it before I got a chance to load any film in and to take any images. And whilst writing on your film and the overall compactness of the Kodak Autographic was pretty cool, it was interesting, the real camera revolution at this moment in time was brewing in Germany, where engineers were just about to change how we see our subject when we take a photograph. Next up, we have the Kine Exakta. This was launched in 1940, and finally we were blessed with a massive quality of life improvement. This German-made camera was the world's first mass-produced 35mm single lens reflex, or SLR, camera. Now, if you're wondering what the heck an SLR is, think of it like this. Instead of having two separate holes on your camera, one to look through and one then to let light through to expose the film so you can take an image, like on the Kodak Brownie, an SLR uses a single hole to both let light into the camera to expose your film and to light up the viewfinder so you can see what the heck you're taking a picture of. Now, for the first time, what you compose in your viewfinder is literally what's going to get exposed onto your film. Additionally, the engineers that designed the Exakta also created a new kind of viewfinder, so photographers had a much bigger window to look through and to compose their images. The engineers used a special magnifying glass lens that magnifies the composition that's being seen through your lens and creates what's called a virtual image for the photographer to work from. Additionally, the engineers also worked with Carl Zeiss, the company that still makes incredible lenses today, to create really fast special lenses for the Exakta. Now, why did they want to do this? Well, because the larger the aperture of the lens, the brighter the image is going to be in the viewfinder, so you can see your composition a lot easier. It's like when you turn up the brightness on your phone screen so that you can see it better, more clearly in sunlight. And for all of the millions of photographers who had struggled with the crappy viewfinders of yesteryear, and me for the past few months doing this video, putting all this together, this camera and this viewfinder was a revolution. Okay, so I managed to get a few shots out of this camera, and surprisingly, for a camera that's over 80 years old, it was pretty simple to use. But this was only the start in cameras getting more user-friendly. The next camera that came along in the 1960s was more than the sum of its parts. If cameras were rock bands, then Nikon F would be the Beatles. It didn't invent rock and roll, but it certainly did perfect it. And released in 1959, this camera was the Swiss Army knife of photography. It could do everything, and it could do it all pretty well. Now, typically at this point in time, you only bought a Japanese camera if you couldn't afford a German one. But the Nikon F changed that forever. And this is because SLR cameras, well, they were slow and clunky at this time, and the Nikon F was anything but slow and clunky. First off, older SLR cameras missed a feature that photographers take for granted these days. It's called the instant return mirror. And back then, when you took your shot, the mirror in the camera that moves out of the way to expose your film didn't return back to the 45-degree position automatically. That means that you can't see anything through your viewfinder until you progress the film forward. This is a complete pain in the bum, and the Nikon F fixed this issue by having a mechanism that returned the mirror back to the 45-degree position after every shot, so that you could look down the viewfinder and compose your next image without faffing around with the film. Additionally, the Nikon F launched with an automatic diaphragm. And again, this is completely taken for granted these days. And the way that the automatic diaphragm works is that it keeps the aperture of the lens open at its brightest aperture until you press the shutter. That means that when you are composing your image, you get this nice bright image in your viewfinder, so you can focus and compose everything and make sure it's all set up perfectly. And then when you press the trigger, the camera uses the aperture that you've set to take your image, before then opening it back up again so that you can compose your next shot. And finally, this was the world's first true system camera. That means that you could swap out different lenses, viewfinders, and accessories to make it do just about anything. If you want to shoot wide-angle landscapes, then there's a lens for that. If you need to capture sports action, you can swap in a telephoto lens and the Auto Film Advance unit so you can take faster shots. And if you need to meter your light precisely, you pop on the Photomic Prism Finder, and the version of the camera that I have right here came with the Photomic light meter included. And for an amateur photographer like me, this was a massive upgrade when experimenting with these cameras. A light meter, whether it's built into the camera or it's a separate device, tells you whether the image that you're taking is likely going to be underexposed or overexposed. And I got a lot more photos that were correctly exposed when shooting with this camera compared to all of the previous ones. But as impressive as the Nikon F was, there was something even more revolutionary coming in the 1970s. Something that would bring us one step closer to the modern digital cameras that we all know, love, and use today. And then came the first camera that included a microchip. Now, before the Canon AE-1, cameras were purely mechanical devices. You pressed a button, turned a dial, or pushed a lever, and things moved inside the camera to make a setting change or to take the actual photo. Now, of course, mechanical cameras are capable of taking incredible images, but well, they're dumb. They can't think for themselves. And that's why Canon came along and added a microprocessor to the AE-1, and it was like they gave the camera a brain. For the first time ever, your camera could think about your exposure settings on your behalf without you having to waste any brain energy, and it'll help you take better photos automatically. The AE-1 program that I have right here will set both the shutter speed and the aperture automatically to make sure that your image is properly exposed, and that's so cool. And the AE-1 had another trick up its sleeve at launch as well. It launched at just under $300, which wasn't cheap at the time, but was way less than other professional cameras that were out there. And this opened up the ability for some serious photography to happen for a whole new generation of enthusiasts at what was a reasonable price point. The camera was so successful that Canon sold over 5 million of them, and the AE-1 is still often recommended by enthusiasts today as the best camera for beginners to pick up if they want to fool around with film photography for the first time. And here's an additional fun fact. You know that satisfying click that your iPhone makes when you take a photo? Well, that's the sound of a Canon AE-1. Some genius at Apple decided to use it as the screenshot sound for Macintosh computers, and later it became the iconic camera sound on iPhones too. Now, of course, I don't think I took any incredible photos with the AE-1, but it was the only film camera out of all the cameras I used for this project that allowed me to focus on my composition rather than faffing around with all the technical aspects of photography, which makes this much more fun to use than everything else we've covered so far. And if you think all this film photography technology was interesting, well, just wait until you see what happened when cameras went digital. If you're old like me, then you'll remember when we switched from VHS tapes to DVDs and how incredible the increase in visual performance was. Well, in photography, I think the switch from film to digital was even more dramatic, and the Nikon D1 led this change in photographic mediums. Released in 1999, the D1 was Nikon's first digital SLR camera. No film here, just a 2.7 megapixel sensor. And there were other digital cameras before the D1, like the Kodak DCS-460. The thing was, however, that the Kodak cost $35,600 when it was released in 1995, whereas at launch the Nikon D1 cost a more reasonable $5,500, which put it firmly into the grasp of working professionals and potentially very keen amateurs as well. The Nikon D1 works in a similar way to the other SLR cameras that we covered a minute ago. You attach your lens, you look through the viewfinder, and you press the shutter button to snap a photo. But rather than light coming through the lens and exposing film, the light now hits a digital sensor, and this information is passed through a signal pathway and eventually is turned into a digital representation of the light that you saw in front of you as you snapped your masterpiece. And another revelation that we all take for granted these days that the D1 brought to the forefront was the 1.8-inch LCD screen on the back of the camera. In what must have been, for the photographer, right, it must have been a massive leap forward from the film cameras of yesteryear. You can now review your images as soon as you've taken them. So rather than having to finish your roll of film and then go home and then go to the lab to get the film processed and then go back to the lab to get your prints and then sit down and actually see if you managed to capture the moment that you thought you had, you can just take your image, look on the back of the camera, and bam, you know if you've captured that critical moment or not. But the real revolution wasn't the camera specs or its features, it was what the D1 represented. This was the camera that forced newspapers and photojournalists to finally ditch their film cameras. Think about that for a second. After more than 100 years of film photography, digital had finally become good enough to take over. Now, I couldn't get my hands on a Nikon D1. I think people collect them, so they just don't exist on eBay. So I ended up with a Nikon D1X instead. And the first thing to note is that this thing is built like an absolute tank. It's heavy and it's rugged, and the best way to demonstrate how overbuilt this camera is to show you how to access the memory card. You've got to open a flap and press a button and press another button and then pull the thing out. It is crazy. Now, for the downside, the batteries that are used in the D1X, well, when it was released, they were known to be rubbish. And if you add another 25 years of use into the mix, well, it was actually quite difficult to take the D1X out and to get any photos before the battery died. But in practice, I found that the Nikon was, well, surprisingly similar to the modern cameras that I'm used to shooting with. The digital files that it creates are way easier to edit than scanned film, and even though the autofocus was kind of slow, it was pretty accurate. So that's the Nikon D1, and as much of a leap in performance it was over film photography, the biggest leap in camera performance happened much much more recently. Now here we are in the present day with my Sony A7R4, a camera that would seem like science fiction to those Kodak Brownie users from the 1900s. But let me put this beast into perspective. Remember that 2.7 megapixel sensor in the Nikon D1 that revolutionized photography? Well, this A7R4 has a 60 megapixel sensor. Additionally, there are no mirrors inside the Sony A7R4. Instead, light comes in through the lens, it hits the sensor, and then we have a screen that displays our images and our composition where the optical viewfinder used to live. And well, for landscape photography, which happens to be my favorite type of photography, this camera is, well, it's basically the end game. I honestly might never have to buy another camera body ever again. And here are a few pictures that I've taken with the A7R4 over the past couple of years. The camera is an absolute joy to use, and honestly, I'm not really sure what I could ask from it with regards to improving its performance. The Sony is incredible, but I think we need to compare some of the images across this timeline. The main thing that I took away from working with each one of these cameras is just how lucky we are to have access to such highly capable digital cameras today. If you compare this scene in the beautiful Lake District here in the UK, where I took a photo with each one of these cameras, well, they all look pretty similar in their unedited form. But as soon as you start editing the images, the amount of information that's been recorded by each one of these cameras, well, it varies dramatically. When I attempted to edit the Kodak Brownie shot, you can see there is literally no information in the file to edit with. It all falls apart very quickly. However, with the Sony file, there is absolutely loads of data, and so editing the photo is much easier. Heck, on the Sony image, you can even zoom in and see people walking across the hilltop. That's how much information has been captured by that incredible modern camera sensor. And when we put the final edited Kodak Brownie image next to the edited Sony image, I think we can really see where 100 years of camera development has taken us. And well, I'm really glad that I started doing photography just 2 years ago using modern cameras rather than starting 100 years back. And with that, if you want to continue on your photography journey, why not click the video that's on the screen right now.